The rain fell in sheets, turning the two-lane road slick and treacherous. Alex gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white in the dim glow of his dashboard lights. The highway was empty, stretched out like a dark ribbon through the forest, disappearing into the misty, endless night. He glanced at his fuel gauge, low, but not desperate yet. Another half hour on this back road, and he'd reach the main highway. Once he was on the highway, things would be safer. Lightning flashed, illuminating the forest on either side of him in a brief white blaze. Trees loomed tall and skeletal, twisted by the storm. Just as quickly, they vanished back into the shadows, leaving the dark even darker. Alex felt a chill run down his spine. Something about this road was unsettling, something more than just the storm. He tried to brush it off. He'd been driving for hours, after all. It was just nerves. A few minutes later, a shadow on the shoulder caught his eye. It was there 1 second, gone the next. He blinked, shook his head, told himself he was imagining things, but a strange unease prickled at him. As he looked back toward the road, he caught another glimpse, this time ahead of him. A small, dark figure standing by the roadside, drenched and shivering in the rain. As he got closer, Alex could see it was a young girl, no older than 12, dressed in a white nightgown that clung to her body in the rain. She stared at him as he passed, her eyes wide and hollow. Against his better judgment, Alex slowed down. Maybe she was lost. But when he looked back through his rearview mirror, she was gone. Vanished, as though she had never been there at all. A shiver ran through him. Had he just seen a ghost? He didn't believe in the supernatural, but something about the girl unsettled him, and there was something else, a strange metallic taste in his mouth like blood or rust that hadn't been there before. Alex took a deep breath, trying to shake it off. He reached for his phone to play some music, but his screen was blank, unresponsive, as if it had simply died. He muttered a curse under his breath. First the storm, then the ghost girl, now a dead phone. It was almost laughable, like a scene from a horror movie. But as he glanced back up at the road, laughter was the last thing on his mind. A set of headlights appeared in his rearview mirror, bright, blinding, and getting closer. Too close. Alex squinted, trying to make out the car behind him, but the lights were so intense they obscured everything else. Whoever it was, they were right on his tail, practically touching his bumper. He tapped his brakes lightly, hoping they'd back off, but the headlights stayed put, almost searing into the back of his eyes. He could feel the pressure of the car behind him, its presence heavy and menacing. It was as if the driver was trying to force him off the road. Alex's heart pounded. He sped up, hoping to create some distance, but the other car matched his speed, keeping that terrible blinding light in his rearview mirror. Just when Alex thought he couldn't stand it anymore, the car veered suddenly, passing him on the left with a roar of the engine. He caught a brief glimpse of the driver's face. A man, his skin pale, his eyes wide and glassy, staring straight ahead without blinking. Then the car was gone, speeding off into the night, disappearing around the next bend. Alex exhaled, his chest tight. That driver looked dead. His face had been gray and sunken, like a corpse. But before he could process it, he noticed something worse. In his rearview mirror, just behind his car, the girl was back, standing in the middle of the road, soaked and staring right at him. He glanced over his shoulder, but she was gone again. The trees crowded close around him, seeming to press in on the road. The rain began to fall harder, a thunder rumbling in the distance, and the metallic taste returned to his mouth, stronger now. It tasted like iron, like blood. The darkness around him grew thicker, deeper, as if the road itself was swallowing him whole. Suddenly, his headlights flickered. He held his breath as they blinked, dimmed, and then shut off completely, plunging him into complete darkness. His heart raced as he fumbled for his flashlight. In the pitch black, he could barely see his hand in front of his face, but he knew he couldn't stop. He'd be a sitting duck out here if he did. With one last flicker, his headlights returned, weaker but enough to show the road ahead. He nearly screamed when he saw the girl standing right in front of him, so close he could see her eyes, staring into his, lifeless and cold. He swerved sharply, barely missing her, his tires skidding as they hit the shoulder. His car shuddered, and he managed to bring it back under control, but the terror was seeping into his bones. He didn't look back this time. He didn't want to know if she was there. The road stretched on, winding and narrow, the rain relentless. The headlights flickered again, but Alex pressed forward, whispering to himself, "Just get to the main road. Just get to the main road." But the road felt endless, a never-ending nightmare of darkness and rain. Then he saw it. Red taillights ahead, glowing dimly in the fog. Relieved, he accelerated, hoping to catch up to the other car, hoping that he wouldn't be alone in this. But as he approached, he realized with a sickening lurch that the car was the same one that had passed him earlier. It was pulled over on the shoulder, facing the wrong direction, as if it had spun out. Alex slowed, pulling up beside it, and what he saw turned his blood to ice. The driver's side window was open, rain pouring in, but the man was slumped over the wheel, unmoving. His eyes were open, staring blankly, his face as pale and lifeless as it had been before. But this time there was no doubt. He was dead. A soft thump echoed from behind Alex, like a child's fist pounding on a window. His heart skipped a beat. Slowly, he turned his head, looking into his rearview mirror. She was there in the back seat, her face close to his, her hollow eyes staring right through him. He couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't breathe. She opened her mouth, and a whisper, faint and terrible, filled the car. Drive. Alex didn't need to be told twice. He slammed on the gas, speeding away from the dead man, the dead girl, from whatever nightmare this was. The road blurred past him, the storm a cacophony around him. He could feel her presence, still in the back seat, her cold gaze fixed on him. When he finally reached the main highway, dawn was breaking. He glanced in his rearview mirror, and she was gone. The metallic taste faded from his mouth, leaving him drained and trembling. As he merged onto the highway, he took a deep breath, finally able to convince himself it was over, that he was safe. But as he drove away, he saw a figure in a white nightgown standing on the shoulder, watching him fade into the distance, her hollow eyes never blinking, her face lost in the mist. And though he tried to tell himself it was just his imagination, he couldn't shake the feeling that she was still there, somewhere in the dark, waiting for her next ride. Late into the night, rain drizzled down as Lila drove alone on a narrow mountain road, miles away from the nearest town. Her GPS had gone dark an hour ago, her phone was down to its last few percent of battery, and the forest around her was thick, pitch black, with only her high beams slicing through the darkness. She was already on edge, feeling a strange unease that had been gnawing at her since she'd turned onto the remote road. Each twist and turn seemed darker, more isolated, like the mountain itself was swallowing her car. Suddenly a figure appeared in the glow of her headlights, a woman, standing in the middle of the road. Lila gasped, slamming on the brakes. Her tires squealed as she came to a jerking stop. Heart racing, Lila watched as the figure approached. The woman was drenched, her hair hanging in wet, stringy clumps around her face, her thin white dress clinging to her skin. Her face was pale, eyes wide and almost lifeless, as though she had been wandering in the storm for hours. Lila hesitated, but then rolled down her window a crack. "Are you okay?" she called out. The woman didn't answer at first. She simply stared, her lips trembling as her eyes flicked to the empty seat beside Lila. Can you give me a ride?" she finally whispered, her voice thin and almost lost in the wind. Lila's instincts screamed at her to say no, to hit the gas and drive away, but something in the woman's face made her heart ache. She couldn't leave her out here in the cold. Reluctantly, she unlocked the passenger door and the woman climbed in without a word. The car filled with the scent of wet earth and mildew as the stranger shut the door, her gaze fixed forward. Lila drove, her grip on the wheel tight, stealing glances at her silent passenger. Every so often, the woman would turn her head toward her, staring with an unsettling intensity that made Lila's skin crawl. She tried to ignore it, to focus on the road, but it felt like there was something wrong in the car now, something dark and heavy pressing down on her. "Where are you headed?" Lila asked finally, trying to break the silence. The woman didn't answer. Her head was tilted, her eyes fixed on something far ahead, lost in the darkness. A chill crept down Lila's spine as she realized the woman's skin was tinged with a faint, sickly blue, her hands white and claw-like in the dim light. But before Lila could say anything, her passenger finally spoke, her voice a low, rasping whisper. "You should have kept driving." Lila's heart stopped. What do you mean?" "Don't stop. Never stop when they're on the road." A gust of cold air blew through the car, chilling her to the bone, even though the windows were shut. Lila's pulse quickened as a faint tapping sound started, like fingers tapping on the glass. She looked in her rearview mirror but saw nothing. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, coming from all around them until it sounded like dozens of hands beating on the windows, clawing to get inside. Who's out there? Lila whispered, trying to stay calm, but her voice quivered with fear. The woman beside her didn't respond. She only stared ahead, her face twisted in a look of pure terror. Suddenly, something large and heavy landed on the roof, the metal creaking under its weight. Lila screamed, gripping the wheel as the car swayed. The thing on the roof was moving, dragging itself from side to side, its weight shifting as it clawed at the metal. "Drive faster," the woman rasped, her voice low and urgent. "Don't let it catch you." Lila's foot pressed down hard on the gas, the car speeding through the winding road as she tried to shake off whatever was clinging to the roof. She swerved, the car skidding as she took sharp turns, hoping to throw it off. But it held on, its claws scraping along the edges of the roof, the sound piercing her ears. The woman's breathing grew ragged. "It's found you. Once it's marked you, it doesn't stop." "Who's found me? What is it?" Lila asked, her voice breaking. "They call it the hitchhiker," the woman whispered, her eyes hollow and distant. "It waits for travelers on the mountain, for those who stop, who show mercy. Once it's with you, it doesn't leave. Not until..." Her voice trailed off, but the implication was clear. Lila's hands were trembling, her mind racing with fear. She sped faster, the car barreling down the mountain road, but the hitchhiker's weight never left. And then, as if sensing her fear, it lowered itself, its face appearing upside down in her windshield, peering in at her. Lila's stomach twisted in horror. Its face was twisted, inhuman, with empty black eyes and a mouth that seemed to stretch unnaturally wide, showing rows of sharp, broken teeth. It was smiling at her, a wicked, knowing smile, as if it was savoring her terror. She felt the car slow, her hands frozen on the wheel, unable to tear her gaze from the creature. The woman in the passenger seat let out a low, mournful sob. Once you see its face, there's no escape. It's already inside. Lila felt something cold, like a hand, grip her shoulder and then her other shoulder, invisible fingers pressing down with impossible force. The hitchhiker's face was still there, grinning at her, its mouth opening wider, wider, until it was nearly split in two, swallowing the windshield in darkness. She screamed, slamming her foot down on the gas. She didn't care about the road anymore, didn't care if she crashed. She just had to escape, to get away from the thing. But as she sped down the road, the creature's face grew closer, as if it were pulling itself into the car, stretching through the glass, that terrible, empty gaze piercing her. Suddenly, the woman in the passenger seat leaned close, her voice a mere whisper in her ear. "You can't outrun it. It's a part of you now." Lila's vision blurred. Her grip on the wheel loosened, her heartbeat slowing as an icy cold washed over her. She could feel it. The hitchhiker, pressing into her mind, but had a dark presence filling her senses, taking root inside her. The road vanished. The storm, the darkness, even her car melted away, leaving only silence and shadows. In her final moments, Lila saw the hitchhiker's face, smiling down at her, its hollow eyes promising that she would never be alone again. The next morning, a sheriff's patrol found her car abandoned on the side of the road. The driver's seat was empty, soaked from the rain, with the faint imprint of a handprint on the inside of the windshield. There was no sign of Lila, only a single chilling message scratched into the dashboard in ragged, desperate letters. Never stop. Never stop. To this day, drivers report seeing a figure on that lonely mountain road, drenched and staring, waiting for the next car to come along. And those unlucky enough to stop say she's still in the back seat, whispering about something that's always following, something that never lets go. The clock on Darren's dashboard read 3:12 a.m. as he sped along the dark, winding road. He was on his way home from a friend's house, the night thick around him, broken only by the narrow beam of his headlights. This road wasn't unfamiliar. He'd taken it 100 times before, cutting through quiet fields and dense woods, always deserted at this hour. But tonight felt different. He couldn't shake the strange feeling that he wasn't alone. He glanced at his phone. No signal, as expected. The radio had been nothing but static since he left the main highway, so he'd resigned himself to the silence, which felt oppressive, heavy. He checked his rearview mirror, nothing but inky blackness stretching back as far as he could see. A chill prickled at the back of his neck, but he ignored it, dismissing it as paranoia. He was just tired, he told himself. It was late, and his mind was playing tricks on him. Up ahead, He saw the outline of something on the side of the road, a figure standing by the ditch, just barely visible in his headlights. His heart skipped a beat. As he drove closer, he realized it was a man, tall and thin, dressed in an old-fashioned suit that looked soaked, as if he'd been out in the rain, even though the night was bone dry. Darren slowed down, his foot hovering over the brake. Maybe the guy needed help. But something about him was off. The man stood perfectly still, staring straight ahead, eyes unblinking, his face almost ghostly pale in the dim light. Darren's gut told him to keep driving, to ignore the man and press on, but he felt compelled to look, drawn by a mix of curiosity and unease. As he passed, he saw the man turn his head ever so slightly, his eyes meeting Darren's for just a moment. His expression was blank, emotionless, but his eyes, they were pitch black, void of any reflection. Darren's blood ran cold, and he hit the gas, speeding away, his pulse racing as he watched the man disappear in his rearview mirror. But as he drove on, the sense of dread only grew worse. He glanced back once more, just to make sure he was alone, and nearly swerved off the road. The man was there, standing in the middle of the road behind him, staring directly at his car, despite Darren being miles down the road. How was that possible? Darren's heart thudded in his chest. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to focus, but the road seemed to stretch endlessly before him, darker than ever, as if it was swallowing his headlights. Trees loomed on either side, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal arms. Suddenly, his headlights flickered, the road momentarily vanishing into blackness. Darren gripped the wheel tighter, murmuring a silent prayer as he tapped the dash, hoping it was just a brief glitch. The lights blinked back on, but his relief was short-lived. The man was in front of him now, standing dead center in the road, only yards away. Darren's heart stopped, and he jerked the wheel to avoid him, his tires screeching as he veered onto the shoulder. He struggled to regain control, barely managing to keep the car from flipping as he skidded to a halt. Breathing hard, he looked up, heart pounding, expecting the man to be right outside his window. But he was alone. The road was empty, as silent and still as a graveyard. Darren sat there for a moment, his hands trembling as he clutched the wheel. He was too afraid to look in his mirrors, afraid he'd see that pale face staring back at him. He squeezed his eyes shut, taking slow, deep breaths, willing himself to calm down. It was just his imagination, he told himself. Just a trick of the light, a shadow. But when he opened his eyes, he nearly screamed. In his rearview mirror, he saw the man in his back seat, his face inches from Darren's, expressionless, his black eyes drilling into him. Darren's blood turned to ice as he felt a cold, damp hand press onto his shoulder, gripping him with unnatural strength. The man leaned forward, his breath cold against Darren's neck as he whispered, "You shouldn't have stopped." Darren's scream ripped through the silence as he floored the gas, his car lurching forward as he tried to shake off the icy grip. But no matter how fast he went, the man was still there. His hand clamped onto Darren's shoulder, his eyes unblinking, face frozen in that terrible, empty expression. He swerved wildly, feeling as if the car itself was fighting against him, its tires skidding, refusing to hold the road. And then, as suddenly as he'd appeared, the man was gone. Darren looked around frantically, his hands shaking as he gripped the wheel, searching the mirrors for any sign of him, but he was alone once more. The cold grip on his shoulder was gone, replaced by a lingering, unnatural chill. Darren's mind raced. He just needed to make it home. That's all. He kept his foot on the gas, not daring to look in his mirrors again. But the road stretched on, twisting and turning with no end in sight. It was like the mountain road had become a loop, leading him in circles, trapping him. Then, out of nowhere, the radio crackled to life, a faint, garbled voice breaking through the static. Darren's heart pounded as he reached for the knob, trying to turn it off, but the voice only grew louder, clearer. It was a man's voice, distorted and hollow but unmistakably familiar. It was his own voice. "You can't escape," the voice whispered. "Not after you saw me." Darren's stomach lurched, his vision blurring as the car seemed to speed up on its own, the engine roaring louder and louder. He couldn't slow down, couldn't stop, as if some unseen force was controlling the wheel, pulling him faster down the endless road. The trees on either side became a blur, twisting into monstrous shapes, their branches reaching out like claws scraping the sides of the car, the sound shrill and piercing. And then, in the distance, he saw headlights. A car was coming toward him, speeding down the road, its lights blindingly bright. Darren squinted, trying to make out the other driver, but as the car drew closer, his blood ran cold. It was his own car, a perfect reflection of his own vehicle, coming straight at him. Inside the other car, he saw himself, his own face pale and terrified, mirroring his every move. They were on a collision course, both cars hurtling toward each other, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He gripped the wheel, bracing himself, his heart pounding as the two cars barreled toward each other closer and closer until everything went black. The next morning, a hiker found Darren's car parked at the side of the road, engine cold, headlights off, as though it had been there for hours. But Darren was nowhere to be found. The door was wide open, and on the passenger seat lay a single damp footprint, as if someone had been sitting there, watching and waiting. They say that if you drive that road alone at night, you might see Darren's car, headlights flickering, abandoned at the side of the road. And if you look closely, you might catch a glimpse of a tall, pale figure standing by the edge of the woods, watching, waiting for his next ride. The rain was coming down in torrents, drumming against the roof of Sarah's car as she drove down the desolate country road. The wipers struggled to keep up, barely clearing the water before another wave splashed down, obscuring her view. She was exhausted, her eyelids heavy, and there was a gnawing feeling in her gut that she couldn't shake. She hadn't seen another car for miles. Her phone had lost signal long ago, and the only sounds were the storm outside and the faint hum of her car's engine. Then, in the flickering glow of her headlights, she saw something on the side of the road, a flash of color. At first, she thought it was debris or a sign, but as she drew closer, she saw it was a child. A little girl, drenched from head to toe, standing by the road in a white nightgown, barefoot, her long hair plastered to her face. Sarah slowed, unsure of what to do. The girl looked so alone, her face hidden by her hair. Her instinct told her it was wrong, that something was off, but her heart ached at the thought of leaving a child out in this storm. Sarah pulled over, rolling down her window just enough to call out, "Hey, are you okay? Do you need help?" The girl didn't respond, didn't even look up. She just stood there, her head bowed, shivering in the rain. Sarah's concern overpowered her fear, and she opened the door, getting out to approach the girl. "Hey, it's okay," she said softly, reaching out a hand. "Are you lost? Do you want to ride?" The girl finally lifted her head, and Sarah's heart skipped a beat. The child's eyes were empty, wide, dark, and bottomless, like two black pools. Her skin was pale, almost gray, and her face was expressionless, a cold blankness that sent a chill down Sarah's spine. The girl tilted her head slightly as if studying her, and then, in a small, hollow voice, she whispered, "He's coming." Sarah froze. The girl's gaze shifted past her, over her shoulder, staring at something in the distance. A low, rumbling sound filled the air, not thunder, but something else, something that made Sarah's blood run cold. She turned around slowly, her heart thudding as she squinted into the darkness. At first, she saw nothing but the downpour and the shadowy shapes of the trees lining the road. But then she saw it, two dim red lights, like eyes, far off down the road, getting closer. They seemed to hover in the air, moving without any visible source, gliding silently toward them. A sense of dread washed over her, and she turned back to the girl, but the child was gone, vanished as if she'd never been there. Panic seized Sarah. She darted back into her car, slamming the door, locking it. Her heart raced as she stared in her rearview mirror, watching as the red lights crept closer, like two burning embers in the storm. Her car shook as the lights stopped right behind her, bathing the interior of her vehicle in an eerie red glow. She could feel a presence, something ancient and malevolent, just beyond her vision, pressing down on her like a weight. Suddenly a tap came at her window, soft but insistent. Sarah's hands trembled as she turned to look. There in the rain was a figure, tall and looming, obscured by the downpour. She couldn't make out a face, only a shadowy form, but she could feel its eyes on her, piercing, hungry. The figure leaned close, and through the glass she heard it whisper in a voice that sounded like gravel grinding against metal, "Open the door." Sarah shook her head, her breathing coming in quick, shallow gasps. She reached for the ignition, but the engine wouldn't start. She tried again, her fingers trembling as she twisted the key, but it was useless. The car was dead, the radio crackling with static, filling the car with an unnerving hiss. "Open the door," the voice repeated, louder this time, almost a growl. The shadow outside moved, and she felt the car shift as something heavy pressed against it. The red lights seemed to flare brighter, filling her vision, blinding her, and she squeezed her eyes shut, her hands clutching the wheel. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat, every instinct screaming at her to run, but there was nowhere to go. Then she felt it, a cold, wet breath against her neck, chilling her to the bone. She opened her eyes, and in the reflection of the rearview mirror, she saw him. A man, or something that once was a man, his skin mottled and gray, with empty black eyes and a wide, unnatural smile stretching across his face. His teeth were sharp, jagged, stained with something dark, and he was watching her, his gaze locked onto hers in the mirror. "Let me in," he whispered, his voice slithering around her, wrapping her in a paralyzing fear. In a blind panic, she reached for the handle, ready to open the door and flee, but then she remembered the girl's warning. "He's coming." The words echoed in her mind, and she forced herself to stay still, to keep the doors locked, no matter how much she wanted to escape. The figure outside pounded on the window, harder and harder, the glass cracking under the force. The red lights flared, filling the car with an intense heat that burned her skin, and she knew deep down that if the glass broke, if he got in, she would be lost. With a desperate scream, she closed her eyes and pressed her hands over her ears, blocking out the noise, blocking out the voice that was now screaming at her to let him in. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went silent. She opened her eyes, her heart pounding, and found herself alone. The red lights were gone, the rain had stopped, and the road was empty, stretching out into the darkness as if nothing had ever happened. She sat there shaking, unsure if it had all been a nightmare, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But then she looked at her window. A handprint was smeared across the glass, dark and damp, like a stain that wouldn't wash away. Her heart pounded as she realized it hadn't been a dream. She had seen him, felt his breath, heard his voice. And as she drove away, her hands white-knuckled on the wheel, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was still there, watching her from the shadows, waiting for the next time she'd be alone on the road at night. To this day, Sarah refuses to drive at night. But others who have taken that road alone have reported seeing red lights in the rearview mirror, slowly creeping closer, until a voice whispers from the darkness, "Let me in." Dan had been on the road for hours, the quiet hum of his car his only companion as he wound his way through the isolated countryside. It was a shortcut he'd taken plenty of times, a narrow road flanked by trees so dense they formed a near-solid wall on either side. Tonight, however, something felt different. The air seemed heavier, the darkness deeper, almost suffocating. As he drove, his headlights caught the glint of something on the shoulder up ahead. A car pulled off to the side, its hazard lights blinking in the dark. Dan slowed down instinctively, leaning forward to see if anyone was inside. As he approached, he could just make out the outline of a man, slumped in the driver's seat, his face obscured by shadows. Dan's sense of duty kicked in. He couldn't just leave someone stranded out here in the middle of nowhere. He pulled over, rolling down his window. "Hey, need any help?" he called out, but there was no response. Hesitating, he decided to get out and check, his flashlight in hand. The night was eerily silent, the only sounds his own footsteps and the quiet hum of his car's engine. He approached the other vehicle cautiously, shining his light through the window. The man's head was tilted down, his face hidden by the brim of his hat. Dan tapped lightly on the glass, calling out again, but there was no reaction. He tried the handle, and the door creaked open. A chill ran through him as he got a closer look. The man's skin was pale, unnaturally so, with a waxy sheen that seemed to almost glow in the light. And then Dan saw it. The man's eyes were wide open, staring straight ahead, completely lifeless. Dan stumbled back, heart racing. He pulled out his phone to call for help, but the screen showed no service. He glanced around, the forest seeming to close in on him. The air felt thick, suffocating, like he was being watched. As he turned back to his car, something caught his eye. A figure was standing in the middle of the road just behind his vehicle. It was a woman, dressed in an old-fashioned black dress, her face obscured by a veil. Dan froze, a deep unease washing over him. He hadn't seen anyone around when he'd stopped, and he certainly hadn't heard anyone approach. "Ma'am, do you need help?" he called out, his voice shaky. The woman didn't answer. She stood perfectly still, her head tilted ever so slightly as if studying him. Dan's flashlight flickered, and when he glanced back up, she was gone. His stomach twisted with fear. He hadn't seen her move, hadn't heard so much as a footstep. He backed toward his car, his pulse pounding in his ears, and climbed in, locking the doors. He glanced in the rearview mirror, hoping he'd imagined it, but his blood ran cold. The woman was standing directly behind his car, her face still hidden by the veil, her hand resting on the trunk. Dan's breath caught as the car's interior lights flickered, dimming until he was bathed in shadows. His rearview mirror fogged up, the temperature in the car plummeting. He tried to start the engine, but it only groaned, refusing to turn over. Panic clawed at him as he kept trying, his hand shaking on the key. Suddenly, a soft whisper filled the car. It was faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. A woman's voice, chanting something over and over. He couldn't understand the words, but the tone was chilling, mournful, filled with a sorrow that felt ancient, timeless. He whipped around, but the back seat was empty. Yet he could still feel her presence, a cold pressure that seemed to press down on him, suffocating. The whisper grew louder, filling his ears, drowning out every other sound. Desperate, he yanked open the door, stumbling out into the cold night air. The woman was gone. Dan took a few shaky breaths, his mind reeling. He was about to get back in his car when he heard it, a rustling in the woods followed by the crunch of footsteps. He looked around, but the darkness was impenetrable. His flashlight flickered out, leaving him in near total darkness. Then he heard it, the unmistakable sound of a voice, this time louder, clearer. "Dan!" it whispered, drawn out like a breath on the wind. He felt a chill crawl up his spine. How did she know his name? The footsteps grew closer, slow and deliberate, crunching on the gravel behind him. He didn't dare turn around. Heart pounding, he lunged for his car door, but before he could grab it, he felt a hand close around his wrist, cold, like ice, with a grip so strong it felt like it was crushing his bones. He whipped around, finding himself face to face with the woman, her veil lifted. Her eyes were hollow, dark, with a strange, otherworldly glow, and her mouth stretched into an unnatural, twisted smile. "Don't leave," she whispered, her voice like nails scraping against his soul. "Stay with me, just like the others." Dan wrenched free, stumbling back, his mind screaming at him to run. He turned, but his legs felt heavy, like he was wading through thick mud. The woman reached out, her hands stretching impossibly long, fingers like talons that brushed his shoulder. Then, as if from nowhere, a blinding light filled the road. A set of headlights coming around the bend. The woman vanished, her presence dissipating into the cold night air. Dan shielded his eyes as the car pulled up, its driver a middle-aged man who looked just as confused as Dan felt. "You okay there, buddy?" the driver called out. Dan forced a nod, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just car trouble." The driver offered him a ride, and Dan didn't hesitate, climbing into the stranger's car without a second glance at his own. As they drove away, he looked back once more. His car sat alone on the road, dark and silent. But in the glow of the taillights, he swore he saw her, a figure standing by the driver's seat, watching him leave. To this day, Dan doesn't drive that road at night. He doesn't go near it at all. But sometimes, late at night, he dreams of that woman, of her cold eyes and twisted smile. And every now and then, he wakes to the feeling of an icy hand resting on his shoulder and a soft, mournful whisper in his ear. "Don't leave." Jake was heading home after a long shift, driving through an isolated mountain road that twisted and turned through thick woods. It was past midnight, and the only sounds were the rumble of his car engine and the faint whispers of wind in the trees. The road was eerily deserted, and the silence outside felt thick, heavy, almost as if the forest were watching him. He was halfway through a tight curve when his headlights caught something strange, an old, weathered sign barely visible in the brush by the side of the road. It read, "Night Falls Rest Stop, 1 mile ahead." Jake couldn't remember ever seeing a rest stop on this road, and he had driven it 100 times before. But exhaustion was catching up with him, and the idea of stretching his legs sounded like a relief. A few minutes later, he spotted the turnoff. He pulled into a small gravel parking lot surrounded by trees, with a single, dimly lit building standing in the center. It looked like an old rest stop from another time, with faded paint and cracked windows. The sign above the door was barely legible, the letters chipped and worn. Jake stepped out, stretching and taking in the silence. Something about the place felt wrong, like the air itself was too still, as if the forest was holding its breath. But he brushed it off, convincing himself he was just tired. He made his way toward the building, hoping there'd be a vending machine inside. The door creaked as he pushed it open, and a musty smell hit him like damp wood and old, rotting paper. Inside was a dimly lit hallway, lined with dusty benches and faded posters on the walls, their colors long faded. The light flickered, casting strange shadows across the floor. Jake walked further inside, his footsteps echoing strangely. As he passed one of the benches, he noticed a figure slumped over, a man with his head bowed, light hands resting on his knees. Jake felt a surge of relief. He wasn't alone. "Hey, are you okay?" he called out. The man didn't respond. He just sat there, unmoving, his face hidden in shadow. Jake took a step closer, but something stopped him. The man's clothing looked old, outdated, like it was from another decade. And his skin, it was pale, almost gray, and there was a faint, unsettling smell coming from him, like decayed wood. Jake backed up slowly, his instincts screaming at him to leave. Just as he turned to go, he heard a low, gravelly voice whisper from behind him, "Where are you going?" Jake froze, his heart pounding. He turned back around, but the man was gone. The bench was empty. His mind raced, searching for some logical explanation, but he knew what he had seen. He hurried back down the hall toward the exit, but when he reached the door, he found it closed. And when he tried to push it open, it wouldn't budge. Panic surged as he rattled the handle, pulling with all his strength, but it was like the door was welded shut. He turned, looking back down the hall, and his stomach dropped. The hallway seemed longer now, stretching into darkness, with more doors lining the walls, doors that hadn't been there before. A cold chill swept over him, and he felt an overwhelming sense of dread. His breaths came in short gasps as he backed away from the door. Suddenly he heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing from somewhere down the hall. He squinted, trying to see through the shadows, and his heart skipped a beat. The man from the bench was standing at the far end of the hall, staring directly at him, his face pale and hollow-eyed, with a twisted, unnatural grin stretching across his face. Jake's instincts kicked in, and he bolted, sprinting down the hallway in the opposite direction. But as he ran, the hall seemed to stretch on forever, each door he passed leading nowhere, every turn bringing him back to the same stretch of hall. His footsteps echoed louder, mingling with the relentless, steady tread of the footsteps behind him. He chanced to look back and saw more figures now, emerging from the shadows, each one with the same twisted smile and hollow, empty eyes, watching him, reaching out with cold, pale hands. Jake's pulse thundered in his ears as he tried door after door, finding only empty rooms filled with more shadowy figures, each one silent, staring as if waiting for him. Finally, he stumbled into a larger room at the end of the hall. There was no way out, only a single chair in the center and a broken mirror on the wall. His reflection stared back at him, his face pale, eyes wide with terror. But then he noticed something chilling. His reflection was smiling. A low, whispering chant began to fill the room. The voices of the figures outside huddled, growing louder, filling his mind with a numbing fear. He backed away, only to feel a cold hand clamp down on his shoulder. He spun around, but no one was there. Yet he could feel the icy grip pulling him down, urging him to sit in the chair. Against his will, his legs buckled, and he sank down onto the chair, his body feeling heavy, drained. The chanting grew louder, filling his ears, until he couldn't think, couldn't breathe. His vision blurred, his mind slipping into darkness. The last thing he saw was his own reflection in the broken mirror, staring back at him with that same twisted grin, a look of unending terror frozen on his face. The next morning, a family driving down the mountain road decided to take a quick break at the rest stop. The place was eerily silent, the building looking even older and more run-down than before. As they wandered through the empty halls, they noticed a figure slumped in one of the chairs. A man, his skin pale, his face frozen in a wide, unsettling grin. No one recognized him, and no one could find any identification. To this day, drivers say that on stormy nights, if you pass by Nightfall's rest stop, you might see figures in the windows, pale faces with wide, unblinking eyes, all watching, waiting, hoping for someone to join them. It was the dead of night, and Tom was driving alone on a rural road, the only source of light his car's headlights slicing through the inky darkness. His GPS had sent him on this back route to save time, but after hours of winding, narrow roads and endless trees, he was starting to regret it. There wasn't a house or gas station in sight, just miles of dense forest crowding in from both sides. The road was so isolated that when he spotted a figure walking along the shoulder, he nearly slammed on the brakes, surprised to see anyone out here at all. The figure was a woman, dressed in a simple, flowing white dress that looked far too thin for the chilly night air. She walked slowly, her head tilted down, long hair hiding her face. She was walking away from him, her steps unsteady, almost like she was lost. Tom's first instinct was to stop and offer help, but something held him back. There was something off about her movements, something unsettling in the way she seemed to glide along the road, her feet barely lifting with each step. Still, his conscience got the better of him, and he pulled over, lowering the window as he called out, "Excuse me, do you need any help?" The woman paused, but she didn't turn around. She just stood there, her back to him, her head slowly tilting, almost as if she were listening. He felt a chill, a sense of foreboding creeping up his spine, but he shook it off. "Hey, are you okay? It's late. You shouldn't be out here alone." For a moment, there was silence. Then, in a low, hollow voice, the woman spoke, barely louder than a whisper. "He's coming." Tom's blood ran cold. Before he could ask what she meant, the woman began to walk again, faster this time, her steps echoing in the silence. The way she moved now was strange, almost frantic, as if she were trying to escape something. And then Tom felt it, a strange, suffocating heaviness in the air, like a weight pressing down on him. A low, rumbling sound started in the distance, growing louder, like a vehicle engine growling through the night. In his rearview mirror, Tom saw two blindingly bright headlights approaching fast, far too fast for this narrow, winding road. He watched in horror as the lights grew larger, bearing down on him with no sign of slowing. Panicked, he pressed the gas and pulled forward, watching as the woman ahead picked up her pace, moving into the trees along the road. He sped up, but the headlights behind him didn't waver, following his every move, keeping pace, never falling back. The light filled his car, so bright it almost hurt to look in the mirror. The headlights felt wrong, too bright, too close, as if they were pushing through the back of his car, swallowing him whole. He tried to pull to the side, to let whatever was behind him pass, but every time he adjusted, the lights followed, staying locked on him. The woman's words echoed in his mind, "He's coming." With his heart pounding, he floored the gas, desperate to outrun whatever was behind him. The car engine roared as he sped down the dark road, his hands clenched tight around the wheel. But no matter how fast he went, the lights stayed right behind him, unyielding. Then, just as he was about to make a sharp turn, the lights behind him vanished. 1 second they were there, blazing, filling the road with unnatural brightness, and the next, they were gone, swallowed by the darkness as if they had never existed. Tom's car screeched around the curve, and he forced himself to slow down, his hands shaking as he peered in the mirror, half expecting to see the lights reappear. But the road was empty, the darkness calm and undisturbed. Breathing heavily, he kept driving, telling himself it was over, that he just imagined it all in his exhaustion. But a few minutes later, he spotted another figure by the side of the road. It was the woman again, standing still this time, watching him, her face now fully visible in his headlights. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were wide, filled with a sorrow that seemed to echo through the night. She raised one hand slowly as if to wave, or perhaps to warn him. And then he saw it. Just behind her, hidden in the shadows, a figure standing in the trees, cloaked in darkness. It was a man, tall and thin, with eyes that seemed to burn with an unnatural light, piercing through the night. His mouth was twisted into a cruel, knowing smile, and he raised one finger to his lips as if telling Tom to stay silent. Tom's stomach twisted, and he hit the gas, not daring to look back, his heart hammering as he sped down the road. He didn't stop, didn't slow down, not until he saw the first flicker of city lights on the horizon, the first signs of civilization. When he finally made it home, he collapsed into bed, his mind racing, haunted by the memory of the woman's warning, of the headlights that seemed to hunt him, of the man who watched him with that dark, knowing smile. The next day, Tom mentioned the strange encounter to a friend who listened in stunned silence. Finally, the friend nodded, explaining that he'd heard of this road before, a road locals called the Devil's Chase. The legend was simple. If you drove alone on that road at night, you might meet a woman, a warning spirit, trying to escape from something no one ever quite understood. And if you didn't heed her warning, then he would come, a malevolent presence, hunting anyone who dared stay on that road too long. Tom never drove that way again, and he learned to keep his night drives to familiar, well-lit routes. But sometimes, when he's alone in his car, he still sees flashes of blinding lights in his rearview mirror, feels the weight of something sinister pressing in from behind. And every time he hears her voice, soft and haunting, whispering from somewhere in the dark, he's coming. Brian was returning from a weekend camping trip with friends, exhausted but content as he drove along a lonely stretch of highway under the starless night sky. His friends had gone home in separate cars, and as he rolled through the quiet road bordered by endless fields, he found himself alone, with only the hum of his car and the occasional chirp of crickets breaking the silence. Around midnight, he saw a sign for an upcoming rest area and decided to pull over to get a quick break and stretch his legs. He was just a few miles from it when he spotted something odd up ahead. On the edge of his headlights, he could make out the shape of an old, rusted car parked on the side of the road, its driver's door wide open as if someone had stepped out and never come back. As he drove past, he tried to peer inside but saw nothing in the shadows. Despite the chill that ran down his spine, he shrugged it off. Probably just a car abandoned long ago, he thought. Minutes later, he spotted the rest area, a small, desolate spot with a few benches and a single, dimly lit restroom building. The lot was completely empty. He pulled in, parked, and got out, feeling the crisp night air bite at his skin. As he stretched, his eyes drifted back down the road toward the spot where he'd passed the abandoned car. Strangely, he felt as if he was being watched, though he told himself it was just nerves. He headed for the restroom, but just as he reached for the door handle, he heard the faint sound of footsteps behind him. He froze, heart pounding, and turned around quickly. There was no one there. Just his car, the dim lot, and the empty road beyond. But something in the air felt heavy, wrong, as if he wasn't really alone. Uneasy, Brian entered the restroom. The light flickered as he walked in, casting strange shadows on the cracked tiles and the peeling walls. He splashed water on his face and tried to shake off his unease. "It's just a rest stop," he muttered, but his words felt hollow. Just as he turned to leave, he heard the faintest whisper, his own name, Brian. The voice was soft, raspy, almost like a breath against his ear. He whipped around, his eyes scanning the empty restroom, but there was no one there. A chill crept down his spine. He didn't wait to figure out what was going on. He rushed out of the restroom, practically jogging back to his car. He climbed in, started the engine, and was just about to pull away when he looked up, and his heart stopped. A man stood in the middle of the road, just beyond the lot, watching him. He was tall, with an unsettlingly thin frame, wearing old-fashioned clothes that looked faded and worn. His face was expressionless, eyes dark and sunken, and even from a distance, Brian felt those eyes boring into him. Brian's hands shook as he shifted into drive, his only thought to get away as quickly as possible. He pulled out of the rest area, keeping his eyes on the man, but when he looked in his rearview mirror a second later, the road behind him was empty. The man had vanished. A few minutes passed as he sped down the road, trying to rationalize what he'd seen, to convince himself it was just his imagination. But then he felt it, an oppressive weight in the car, a coldness that seemed to seep into his skin. Nervously, he glanced in the rearview mirror. His heart dropped. The man was sitting in his back seat, his hollow eyes fixed on Brian, a faint, twisted smile stretching across his pale face. Brian gasped, swerving the car in panic. When he looked back again, the man was gone. He sped up, hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white, his heart hammering in his chest. But every time he looked in the mirror, the man would appear. Sometimes sitting, sometimes leaning forward, his face inches from Brian's, his smile widening each time, his empty eyes never blinking. Desperate, Brian pulled over, his car skidding to a halt on the gravel shoulder. He jumped out, his chest heaving as he sucked in the cold night air, eyes darting around wildly. The road was empty, the fields silent, as if nothing had happened. Shaking, he climbed back into the car, but this time, not daring to look in the mirror. He sped off, focusing only on the road ahead, but the silence in the car was suffocating. It felt like he was being smothered by an invisible presence, one that lingered just out of sight. After what felt like hours, he finally reached the lights of a small town. Relieved, he pulled into a gas station and stumbled out of the car, catching his breath as he leaned against the hood. He went inside, trying to calm himself down, grabbing a coffee to steady his nerves. As he paid, the clerk, an older woman, gave him a curious look. "You look like you've seen a ghost, son," she said with a smirk. Brian forced a shaky smile, but something in her eyes turned serious. "You didn't drive past Black Hollow, did you?" He frowned. I don't know. It's just a highway. Why?" She sighed, her expression darkening. "There's an old legend around here. They say a man died on that stretch of road, way back when. Car broke down, and he went looking for help. He was never found. People say he still walks that road, looking for a ride. Sometimes he'll get in your car without you even knowing." Brian's heart skipped a beat, the memory of those hollow eyes flashing in his mind. The clerk looked at him, her gaze piercing. "If you see him, whatever you do, don't look in the rearview mirror." Brian's coffee slipped from his hands, spilling across the counter, but he barely noticed. He rushed out of the station when he was on deck, threw himself back into the car, and drove off, too afraid to look back. Even now, he avoids that highway, never driving alone at night, and he never ever looks in his rearview mirror for too long. But sometimes, on quiet nights, he feels a chill creep into the car, feels a presence lurking just behind him. And in those moments, he grips the wheel tightly, eyes fixed forward, silently praying that he'll make it home before the man in the mirror decides he's stayed long enough. Lena was driving home from a late shift, winding through a desolate stretch of road bordered by deep, dense woods. The headlights cut a narrow path through the darkness, illuminating nothing but the endless line of trees stretching in every direction. She'd always hated driving this road at night, but tonight there was an oppressive silence that made her even more uneasy. It was as if the forest itself was watching her, holding its breath. As she rounded a bend, her headlights swept across something lying in the road ahead. A bundle, maybe a bag. She slowed, squinting to see. But as she got closer, she realized it wasn't a bag at all. It was a small doll, sprawled out on the pavement, one arm stretched out as if reaching for something. Its painted face stared lifelessly up at her, eyes fixed open, a small smile on its face. She shivered but tried to shrug it off. It was just a creepy doll someone had lost or thrown out. She maneuvered around it and kept driving, eager to put some distance between her and the eerie toy. But as she continued down the road, she noticed something strange. Another doll lying on the pavement a little farther down, dressed in different clothes but with the same lifeless expression, the same eerie, painted eyes staring straight at her. It was lying in almost the exact same position as the first, one arm outstretched, the other bent, as if it had been carefully placed there. Lena felt a chill run down her spine, but she kept driving, her eyes darting between the road and the rearview mirror. A mile or so later, another doll appeared in the road. This one looked older, its fabric dress torn and faded, its hair matted, but it was lying in the same pose, staring blankly up at her with that same unnatural smile. The dolls kept appearing every few minutes, each one spaced evenly along the road, each one facing up toward her headlights. Her grip on the wheel had tightened, and a wave of nausea began to creep over her. She couldn't shake the feeling that the dolls were somehow watching her. She sped up, hoping to outrun the unsettling scene, but the faster she went, the more frequently the dolls appeared, scattered along the center of the road like a breadcrumb trail, leading her deeper into the woods. Her pulse quickened, her mind racing with half-formed thoughts. Had someone left them here on purpose? Was this some twisted prank? But just as she rounded another bend, she saw something that made her heart stop. A figure standing on the side of the road, waiting. It was a little girl, barely more than 6 or 7, dressed in a simple, old-fashioned white nightgown, her hair dark and tangled. She was holding a doll in her hands, an ancient, ragged thing that looked almost identical to the others scattered along the road. The girl's face was blank, expressionless, but as Lena's headlights fell on her, she turned her head slowly, her dark eyes locking onto Lena's with a gaze that felt wrong. Lena's foot froze on the pedal, her mind screaming at her to keep going, but something held her in place. The girl lifted one hand, pointing down the road, her face still expressionless, her eyes fixed unblinkingly on Lena. Suddenly, Lena's car shut off. The headlights went dark, the engine died, and she was plunged into absolute silence and darkness. She tried to start the engine, but it wouldn't even turn over. Panic surged as she frantically twisted the key, her heart pounding. In the silence, she heard something soft, almost like the sound of rustling fabric. She looked up and her breath caught in her throat. The little girl was closer now, standing at the edge of the road just feet away from her car, still clutching the doll. She hadn't moved in any natural way. It was as if she'd just appeared there. Her dark eyes bore into Lena, and her mouth curved into a slow, unnatural smile, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Then she heard it, a soft tapping on the back window. Lena's blood ran cold, her body frozen in terror. She didn't dare look in the rearview mirror, but the tapping grew louder, insistent, until she could feel it reverberating through the car. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white, and her breath came in short, panicked gasps. "Go away," she whispered, barely able to get the words out. The tapping stopped. For a long, agonizing moment, there was only silence, so complete it felt like the world had stopped. Slowly, she risked a glance at the back window. The little girl was gone. She let out a shaky breath, trying to calm herself, but then she saw something that made her blood freeze. In her side mirror, she saw dozens of dolls lying on the ground around her car, all positioned in that same unnatural pose, all of them facing her. It was as if they'd come alive, crawling up from the road, surrounding her, trapping her in place. With a surge of desperation, Lena twisted the key again, and this time, the engine sputtered to life. She didn't hesitate. She threw the car into gear and sped off down the road, her heart racing as she tore through the darkness, ignoring every twist and turn as she focused on one thing: getting away. The dolls continued to appear, scattered along the road, each one staring up at her as if to say, "We know." But she didn't stop, didn't look back, not until she saw the lights of a small diner up ahead, a beacon of safety in the dark. She pulled into the lot, her hands shaking as she parked and stumbled out of the car, her legs barely able to hold her up. She rushed inside, and the warmth of the diner felt like a lifeline, a break from the oppressive darkness outside. The waitress behind the counter looked up, taking in Lena's pale face and trembling hands. "Rough night, honey?" she asked. Lena nodded, too shaken to speak. She looked back out the diner's windows, half expecting to see dolls lined up outside, waiting. As she sipped the coffee the waitress brought her, she forced herself to calm down, to tell herself it was all in her mind. Just a trick of the night, a product of exhaustion. But when she finally left the diner, she found a single doll lying on the hood of her car, its head turned slightly, as if it had been watching her inside. Its painted smile seemed wider than before, more knowing, more sinister. She never took that road home again. Jake was driving through the winding mountain roads late at night, his car the only one in sight as he climbed higher and higher into the dark, mist-covered peaks. The road was narrow, with sharp drops on one side and towering cliffs on the other, and his headlights barely pierced through the fog that seemed to thicken with every turn. He was in a rush, hoping to make it to a small town nestled in the valley before midnight. But the silence of the road, broken only by the hum of his engine, started to feel oppressive. There was no sound from the forest, no distant calls of animals, just an eerie, unnatural quiet that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. About halfway up the mountain, he spotted a figure standing by the side of the road. It was a woman, wrapped in a thin coat, her hair blowing in the night wind. Her head was down, and she looked as if she'd been standing there for a long time, her shoulders hunched and her hands clenched tightly at her sides. Jake hesitated, slowing the car as he approached her. The idea of leaving someone stranded out here didn't sit right with him, even if she did seem out of place. He rolled down the window as he pulled up beside her. "Excuse me, are you all right? Do you need a lift?" The woman didn't answer, just stood there, staring at the ground. Her hands were pale and shaking, as if she were freezing. Jake tried again. "It's dangerous out here. I can take you to town if you want." This time, the woman looked up and Jake felt a jolt of unease as he met her gaze. Her face was deathly pale, her eyes hollow and red-rimmed, and her expression was one of pure terror. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but no sound came out. Then she lifted a trembling hand and pointed up the road. He turned, following her gaze, but saw nothing except the dark, foggy road winding into the mountains. "Is something wrong?" he asked, turning back to her. But when he did, she was gone. One moment she'd been standing right there beside his car, and the next, the spot was empty. A chill crawled down Jake's spine, but he told himself he was just tired. Maybe she'd slipped into the trees, or maybe his mind was playing tricks on him. He rolled up the window and continued driving, shaking off the unsettling encounter. The road grew steeper, the fog thicker, swirling around his car like smoke. The farther he went, the more it felt like he was driving into something unnatural, a place untouched by time or reason. Suddenly, his headlights illuminated something else in the road up ahead, a dark shape lying across the center line. He slowed down, squinting to make it out, and realized with a sickening lurch that it was another person lying face down, their arms splayed out, as if they'd fallen right there. Heart pounding, Jake stopped the car, the beam of his headlights cutting through the fog and casting eerie shadows across the figure. He leaned out of the window, calling out, "Hey, are you all right?" No response. He took a deep breath, steeling himself as he climbed out of the car, his steps hesitant. The air was freezing, and the silence felt thicker than the fog. He approached the figure cautiously, trying to shake off the gnawing feeling of dread. But as he got closer, he noticed something strange. The figure on the ground was wearing the same thin coat as the woman he'd seen earlier, her hair the same tangled mess. She was lying in the exact same spot she'd been standing, as if she'd somehow fallen there after he'd driven away. His pulse quickened as he knelt beside her, reaching out a shaking hand to gently touch her shoulder. "Ma'am?" The woman didn't move, but as his fingers brushed her coat, her head turned, her empty eyes staring straight into his. He stumbled back, barely able to breathe as her mouth opened, and in a low, rasping voice she whispered, "Don't go any farther." Jake scrambled to his feet, heart racing, but as he backed away, she was gone again, vanished like mist into the night. Shaken, he staggered back to his car, slamming the door shut. He gripped the wheel, trying to steady his breathing, his mind racing. Maybe he should turn around, go back down the mountain. But he couldn't explain why. He felt an almost magnetic pull to keep going. Against every instinct screaming in his head, he shifted into gear and drove on, his headlights cutting through the fog as he climbed higher. It wasn't long before he began to see movement along the edges of the road, shadows flickering just outside the glow of his headlights, figures that seemed to materialize from the fog, only to vanish the moment he looked their way. He tried to ignore them, telling himself it was just his eyes playing tricks on him. But then, up ahead, he saw another figure standing in the middle of the road, blocking his path. It was the woman again, but this time she was closer, her eyes wide with fear, her mouth stretched into a silent scream. She lifted her hand and pointed directly at him, her eyes burning with desperation. He slammed on the brakes, skidding to a halt just feet away from her. But as soon as he stopped, she vanished, replaced by an overwhelming silence that pressed in from all sides. A sound broke the quiet, a faint, distant whisper, echoing through the fog. It grew louder, more insistent, until it was all around him, filling the car with a chilling chant, a single word repeated over and over, "Turn back, turn back, turn back." His hands shook on the wheel as he fought the rising panic. He wanted to turn around, to flee, but something was compelling him forward, drawing him deeper into the mist. Then, just as suddenly, the whispering stopped. He was left in total silence, save for the faint rumble of his car's engine. He took a shaky breath and put his foot on the gas, but before he could move, his headlights flickered, casting brief shadows that seemed to shift and stretch unnaturally. The engine sputtered, and with a final strangled gasp, it died, leaving him alone in the dark. He sat there, paralyzed, as the fog thickened, wrapping around the car like icy tendrils. A faint tapping sound came from the passenger side window. Slowly, he turned his head. There, staring at him from outside the glass, was the woman, her face inches away from his, her eyes filled with sorrow and something darker, a warning he had ignored. In a voice that barely rose above a whisper, she spoke again, her words like ice in his veins. "He's here." Before he could react, the windows fogged up from the outside, obscuring everything in a thick, frosty haze. In the mirror, he saw shapes moving, figures pressing close against the glass, as if they were trying to reach in, their hands sliding down, leaving smears in the frost. Then, through the static of his terror, he heard it. A low, guttural growl, reverberating from somewhere just behind him. Jake closed his eyes. gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white, and tried not to scream.